that I wanted to talk about some chronic health effects, but I think the room is really interested in these acute health effects associated with manure activities. We know that, and we've known for a long time, that there's a lot of compounds in the manures. My background is industrial hygiene, which nobody really knows what that means unless you're one of them. I deal with worker health and safety, more on the health than the safety. I've been in pulp and paper industry for a decade, so you guys smell just as good as a paper mill. So hydrogen sulfide, sulfur compounds I've been dealing with since the early 90s. And so some of the issues that we're having as far as exposures and generation of gases that are acutely hazardous are the same, not in only your industry, but many other industries. So I'm going to try and give you some recommendations that have been adopted quite successfully by other industries. But at the same point in time, know that I've had people go in for a rescue, somebody well-trained, occupational health nurse that knew better than to go into a high H2S area, and she survived, but not much quality of life in a vegetative state for a long period of time. So this hydrogen sulfide exposure issue that we're having in manure operations is similar in other industries, so we're going to try and bring this information to you today, which is why I brought some monitors that we've got one here, but we've got a bunch in the booth if you want to put your hands on. So we know that high concentrations, even for a very short period of time, can have really serious health outcomes. The two compounds that we've really been focusing on here today is hydrogen sulfide, which is generally in the manure pit, most of the time in barn operations, the room concentrations where the pigs are and where the workers are. Normal operations, not pumping, the concentrations are fairly low, almost undetectable with these. Once we start moving manure, then the concentrations in the pit become airborne, and they can come up into the room. So we've talked about that already. I did want to give you some numbers. I do like some numbers. If we're looking at chronic health effects, we do recommend that 10 parts per million is a limit you don't want to exceed over 40 hours a week for a working lifetime. So 30 years at 10 ppm is considered safe for the long term. When we get those high concentrations, the data vary by your sources, but at 50 to 100 parts per million, you start to see effects of altered breathing. What typically happens if you are going into a manure pit or you're in an area where there is hydrogen sulfide generated, it can go from a low concentration to 50 to 100 and keep going pretty high depending on where you are and how close you are to the source of something decaying. So we start to get at 100 to 300 pulmonary edema. That means fluid in the lungs. Collapse can happen very quickly as the concentration increases. When we're at what we say 1,000 parts per million, nearly instant death. So it ceases your ability to breathe. So it basically paralyzes the respiratory system. If you grab somebody and bring them out, they won't be able to breathe. You must administer CPR to get the respiratory system going back into effect. One of the things that's interesting about hydrogen sulfide is that it's what we call heavier than air, right? So what does that mean in your barn? Where are you going to find it? Down low, right? So it's heavier than air. Now when we start talking about methane, which we know is trapped in this foam, if you have that issue, is that it's lighter than air. And the problem with that is that's where we have a lot of our electrical outlets, that's where we've got our pilot lights, everything is up high in the air. So methane, which is associated in the manure pit, but it's a huge problem when it gets released into our rooms when the foam breaks. Health effects, it's an asphyxiant. So basically it's saying the more methane I have in the room, the less oxygen I have to breathe. So it doesn't cause this chemical physiological reaction like hydrogen sulfide does. But what the big problem is with that is it's flammable. So when it's in foam, take a block of foam, it's about 50 to 70% methane. The air we breathe is 20% oxygen. So a lot of that oxygen is displaced. We have a really high concentration of methane trapped in the foam. That concentration has so much methane, there's not enough oxygen to combust. So it's safe until the foam breaks. And when the foam breaks, that high concentration now, it spreads out through the room and goes back into what we call the flammable range. So it dilutes as it's moving through the barn. It's heading upward or wherever the wind is taking it. Once it gets to diluted down to 15% or down to 5%, it's now flammable. So any spark, any hot work, any cigarette smoke, any light switch turning on that sends a spark, any activation of energy can initiate this fireball. And one of the issues is if there is a spark and a high pocket of methane in that room, and that happens to be where we have, say, our LP tank, and if that fire hits the LP tank, then we have the explosion and the more traumatic outcome. So the issue is with the foaming manure is that acute high concentration diluting into the barn and becoming explosive. And I said again, it's lighter than air, so the methane likes to travel upward if there's not ventilation going on. And so we'll talk about how we want to tackle that with monitoring. So we know some of our friends in the past year, both here and in other states. We've had some unfortunate double fatalities with hydrogen sulfide. Somebody dropped something and just was going to go pick it up, right? I dropped something, I'm going to pick it up and get it out of my manure pit. The problem is, anybody smell hydrogen sulfide? Right? What's it smell like? A little rotten egg, right? What happens is the concentration increases. Can you still smell it? No. So you have lost the ability to sense when it's really, really dangerous. So it's called olfactory fatigue. There are monitors that are designed to be our noses for us. So we had 2 fatalities. A son went in, a father went in to rescue him and made some decisions trying to save his family life. So we know that there's, the manure gas sign. Who has a sign posted at their building? Has anybody adopted this sign? Right. I've worked with some of the bigger livestock cattle producers in our area, and they put signs up all over the place. But the main recommendations, know that there's a hazard with manure gas in general. Prevent entry into the manure pit when it is potentially got hydrogen sulfide. Obviously don't enter during or just after agitation. Ventilate the spaces. We've talked about that quite a bit. And then the last recommendations on the sign are, if you have to go in and there could be hydrogen sulfide, get a harness, have a buddy there to pull you out, and have a SCBA. Anybody have an SCBA? If you don't have a sign, you probably don't have an SCBA. A lot of people are like, well, I dropped this in and I've got to get it, but I don't have an SCBA. What am I supposed to do? I'm just going to go in and get it. Right? Not a rule follower in that case. You can't smell the hydrogen sulfide, so if you have a monitor, again, this for hydrogen sulfide, it's about $120 last 2 years. Throw it away, get a new one. So you can do some monitoring to see if it's at risk before you put yourself in that life-altering situation. When we have the foaming manure, here's an example of the yellow sign that we've got in the back of the room. Please pick one up. It's just half of it. It took too much space. So we know that the methane is trapped in the foam. The sources for breaking the foam, right? We talked about agitating the manure pit, but just as much as dropping feed onto the manure pit can break that foam, and if it gets diluted into that area where there is a source, if you're doing welding or hot work, that could be enough to start the fire. And then we also know that pressure washing is an issue. Pressure washing also sends a lot of liquid into the manure pit and generates hydrogen sulfide concentrations to increase in the room. So pressure washing we know is an issue. Sources of combustion, I just wanted to highlight those. Electric motors, think of anything that's plugged into the wall or anything that you're carrying with you. Pilot lights, as has been mentioned, any welding or cutting, grinding, any metal work in that area could set a spark that could ignite methane. Faulty damaged wiring is also a known source for causing some of these explosions. And if you have smoking, not in the barn, please. So it's critical to eliminate these combustion sources when you're doing any of those high-risk foam, possibly foam-breaking activities, right? So the recommendation is to turn off the power or turn off the heaters. Anything that cycles on and off, just keep the conditions in the room constant so you don't have that spark of on or off equipment. Some of the at-risk decisions that are associated with some of these outcomes are, I don't have an SCBA, but I only need to go in for a second, right? And so that's a common issue. People say I can hold my breath. And the father that went in to rescue his son probably said, I'm going to hold my breath. I know there's a problem in here. If you think about it, you've got to try and go down, lift 150 pounds in an emotional situation, high adrenaline, pull a person out and carry them back out. You cannot hold your breath. I don't care how much you practice. I've had the fan on long enough, and we've had some fatalities a few years ago where somebody went into their pumped manure pit. It had been pumped several days. They had vented it. They hadn't gone in, and 3 days later they went back into the pit to do some work. It was clean. But the concentrations of hydrogen sulfide were still high in that pit. So again, simple test, monitor. So we'll show you how to monitor. I pumped days ago is also an issue. So this is the same as you have a utility worker going out into a manhole to do repairs in a city. They have to check that space before they go into it. So treat yourself with that same amount of respect as your city workers. So these monitors that are available, we have a whole bunch of them and manufacturers on display in the booth out on the Great Plains Center. The one I keep playing with here is low cost. These used to be about $1,000 a monitor. So they're available on web. We don't know which one of them is going to be best stored in a hog environment. Because dust and stuff may interact with them. So that's something that we're looking at the University of Iowa is which ones are the most robust for this industry. There are single gas monitors, which is what I'm passing around. It's small enough to put on the end of a stick and check the space before you go in. The rule is 4 feet in front of you to the left and to the right before you enter an area. But it's also small enough to wear, right? It's not something big. It's half the size of a cell phone these days. There are ones that measure one gas at a time, and there are also multi-gas monitors. If you have foaming manure and are concerned with methane, you get a monitor that reads for explosive gases. Those cost a little bit more because you don't want that monitor to be that energy source and set off a methane. So those have to be what's called intrinsically safe. So those monitors cost a little bit more money. Currently, we don't know how long they're going to last in the ag environment. What we do recommend, and calibration was mentioned, what you want to make sure of is that when the monitor is giving you a number, or it's saying 0, that it's really 0, right? So when the monitor starts to fail, it tends to read numbers low. So for hydrogen sulfide, you can get a bottle of gas, put it on the monitor, and just make sure that it responds. For carbon monoxide, you can put it in a tailpipe and get a response. But you want to make sure that you're getting a reading when the gas is actually there. So it's called a bump test. Right now, all of the manufacturers' recommendations say use industry recommendations. And right now, this industry doesn't have recommendations. So we hope to be working with you guys and with the associations in order to see what is the best handling procedure for these monitors to make sure that they're working. So we've got some information. We're trying to insert the when to use a monitor, how to use the monitor before you walk into a space. You want to make sure on your way entering into the space that you've checked the air quality, as well as have it on you as you're going in. If you do have multiple components and you have methane as an issue and you decide to buy one today, great. There are a few manufacturers, I'll talk to you, not being recorded, on some of my favorite ones. But you want to make sure that you check for oxygen first, because in some cases the explosive measurement, which here is the percent LEL, it may not read true if there's not enough oxygen, right? Because it does a little combustion test inside the monitor. So if there's not enough oxygen, it's like, oh, your LEL's low. But that's only because there isn't enough oxygen. So you want to make sure that you test oxygen and then your explosive gas and then whatever compounds that you're looking at, in this case, hydrogen sulfide. And you do want to test from outside the pit before you go in and see that it's safe. If it's not safe, continue ventilating over time. And so we've got some recommendations for how to operate these devices in different situations, including the foaming manure issue.